Our Bible reading this morning is from Hebrews chapter 11. It's the first 7 verses of chapter 11, and then a couple of verses at the end of the chapter and the first 2 verses of chapter 12. So the book of Hebrews chapter 11. Now faith is confidence in what we hope for, and assurance about what we do not see. This is what the ancients were commended for. By faith we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made out of what was visible. By faith Abel brought God a better offering than Cain did. By faith he was commended as righteous, when God spoke well of his offerings, and by faith Abel still speaks, even though he is dead. By faith Enoch was taken from this life, so that he did not experience death. He could not be found, because God had taken him away. For before he was taken, he was commended as one who pleased God. And without faith it is impossible to please God, because anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him. By faith Noah, when warned about things not yet seen, in holy fear built an ark to save his family. By his faith he condemned the world and became heir of the righteousness that is in keeping with faith. And then verse 39. These were all commended for their faith, yet none of them received what had been promised, since God had planned something better for us, so that only together with us would they be made perfect. Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles. And let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of faith. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. And David will bring those words to us later.
So a plan for these verses is simple. We're going to take a run through the verses firstly. And then what we want to do is ask 2 big questions. Firstly, what is God doing in these verses? And then secondly, what are people doing in these verses? Because we want to get to the question, what are we to do with the verses? So quite simply, we're going to run through the verses. We're going to ask what is God doing in the verses, and then we're going to ask what are people doing in the verses, so that we can see what we are doing in the verses. So let's run through the verses that we looked at together. Now Hebrews 11, isn't it? It's a very well-known chapter. You might call it the faith chapter. Some people call it the faith chapter. Some people call it the hall of faith, as you see all of these great characters of faith, because it goes through Old Testament character after Old Testament character and commends them one after another for their faith, for the faithful things that they did. And we didn't read all of chapter 11, but we read enough to get a flavour from the verses that we did read, that the chapter proceeds by saying, here is someone, let's look at their faith. Here is another person, let's look at their faith. Here's another person, let's look at their faith, and so on, and so on, and so on. And that's what the chapter does for the majority of the chapter. But it actually starts in verse 1 by defining faith. It says here in my translation, now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. I think you had confidence and assurance in the version that was read out. The assurance of things hoped for, conviction of things not seen. And those words, assurance, conviction, confidence, they can be taken to mean some sort of inward confidence, solid belief that even though God is doing things that I haven't seen yet, my faith means that I believe 100% in everything that the Bible tells me about God. That's how we can take those words. It's something that I believe up here. It's my confidence, it's my belief that God is doing something, and I'm going to trust that. But here they seem to be a little bit more than that. They seem to be a little bit more than something that's just up here, something that's just in my mind. Here, faith seems to be the thing that doesn't only think about and assent to the things that God is doing, but it seems to be the thing that grasps hold of the promises that God has made. And that's absolutely valid within the words that are chosen, the words that are used there. It's the thing that's grasping onto these promises. It's the thing that's actually driving people forward and helping them to do something with the promises that helps them to actually experience life lived in the reality of these promises. So they're starting to experience the reality of what God's doing in the world because they're grasping onto the promises and they're making choices based on the promises and they're doing something with the promises. And so it's changing lives. This faith is changing lives. It's changing their experiences. It's changing their choices and their expectations. It's kind of like if we know there's an election coming up. It's kind of like if we were convinced that the next Prime Minister, whoever it's going to be, is going to decide that we all have to learn Spanish. And we become convinced of that. Well, what does faith look like in that setting? Faith looks like us today starting to learn Spanish, doesn't it? If we really have faith that the next Prime Minister is going to make us all learn Spanish, we start today, don't we? We start to learn Spanish because we trust it and we grasp onto that and it pulls us forward and it makes us do something. But that's what we see with these Old Testament characters. With Abel given over an acceptable sacrifice, being able to kind of grasp onto what God's doing and do something acceptable. Enoch being taken up by God and not experiencing the curse the way everybody does. Noah constructing the ark when the people around him are going, it's not raining. Abraham travelling all that distance towards the land that God has promised him. Sarah believing God's promise that she'll have an heir and a son. Jacob blessing his sons in that prophetic way that he does. Moses taking the side of God's people when he could have taken the side very easily of the Egyptians who had raised him where he was in good standing. Rahab hiding these spies who come into her house when she could have easily sided with the rest of her town. But we see also that with all of these acts of faith, everything that's pushing people on, helping them to grasp onto God's promise, something even better was coming, and that's what we see in verse 40. So by the time we look at all those Old Testament characters and we see something better is coming, we get into chapter 12, 1 and 2, and it says, just like those who have gone before us, who have lived in a certain way because of their faith pushing them on, so we also should lay aside every weight and run with endurance as we look to Jesus in faith. That's the run through. That's the thought that's going on here. Just like all of these guys grasped onto faith, so we also lay everything aside, run, grasp onto faith, grasp onto Jesus. That's what's happening. And at this point, it's good for us to stop and ask, what actually is it that God has been doing in these verses? What is it that God's been doing through chapter 11 and into chapter 12 and on further into chapter 12? And what we should be able to see is that in these verses, God is doing something very, very big. What we see from chapters 11 and 12 is that God is doing one big thing, which starts at the beginning of creation, that runs to the end of time, that involves his son Jesus, and that involves setting up an eternal kingdom. It's all there within those chapters. And that eternal kingdom, and in that eternal kingdom, Jesus is sat at the right hand of God. So let's see that. Let's see how that works. So in chapter 11, all of these Old Testament characters are all living for God's promises. They're all being driven forward by this future-focused faith. So in verse 10, for example, Abraham is looking forward to a city that has foundations whose designer and builder is God. what's going on there? We're speaking about Abraham moving from one place and moving to another. And the author says he's looking forward to this city that God is building. In verse 16, he's speaking about them in general, saying they desire a better country, a heavenly country. And then it goes on to say then they desire a city that God is building. And the theme that's running through chapter 11 is that by faith, everyone desires this better land, this better country, this better city. And what they're working for, what they're grasping onto, is the city, the country, the thing that God promises, that God builds, and over which God rules. But the key to understanding chapter 11, we read it in verses 39 to 40. It's not the only times it says it. It says this, and all these Old Testament characters, though commended through their faith, did not receive what was promised, since God had provided something better for us, that apart from us, they should not be made perfect. It's pretty much a repeat of what's said in verse 13. These all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, having acknowledged they were strangers and exiles on earth. And so they can see that God's preparing something that He's promised, but they die before they're able to experience it in its fullness. They can see it coming from afar, and they can grasp onto these promises, and it pushes them forward, but they don't quite get there. They have a future-focused faith pushing them towards God's promises. They don't actually reach them. They've been commended for their faith, but they don't reach the goal. Why? Because throughout that whole Old Testament period, God is still doing that one big thing. He's still building. He's still in the process of building that eternal kingdom. That is the hope that they are grasping onto. Verse 40 of chapter 11 is interesting, isn't it? They don't receive what they promised, since God had provided something better for us, that apart from us, they will not be made perfect, or together with us, they will be made perfect. God's big picture plans, they're not just for the Old Testament people, they're not just for the New Testament people. We have in this verse a bringing together of the Old Testament people and the New Testament people, all being brought together as God's faithful people. And if we read into chapter 12, we're going to see how that happens. It's not going to be a surprise to us, but we're going to see how that happens. Verses 1 and 2 in chapter 12 say, therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising his shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. There's a bunch of details in those verses. For example, in verse 2, Jesus is called the author of faith and perfecter of faith, and for the joy set before him, he endures the cross, and he's sat down now at the right hand of God. But let's think firstly about Jesus as perfecter of faith. In chapter 11, the Old Testament characters, the Old Testament saints, are still waiting to be perfected. They haven't received that perfection. But Jesus here is the perfecter of their faith. We need to get what that means. Old Testament people are living in faith, waiting for God to keep his promises, and God does that in Jesus. So what was the hope of the Old Testament? The hope of the Old Testament was Jesus. And Jesus is the author of faith. So when they were being faithful to Jesus, and when they were looking forward in faith, they were looking forward to him perfecting the faith. He stands at the beginning of the faith, he stands at the end of the faith. So when Moses is being faithful, he's being faithful to Jesus, who's standing at the beginning and at the end of his faith. And when they'll be perfected at the end of time, they're going to be perfected by Jesus through the cross. Because God is doing one big thing from beginning of time to the end of time. He's exalting and glorifying Jesus as he builds this kingdom. And where do we find Jesus in these verses? Well, from verse 2, we no longer find Jesus on the cross. We find Jesus sitting at the right hand of the throne of God, at the right hand of his Father on the throne. And this is really, really, really important within the book of Hebrews. This one thought is probably the key thought in the book of Hebrews. Jesus sitting at the right hand of his Father now, in his resurrected state. Because all through Hebrews, Jesus sitting at his Father's right hand shows us that we're in the final act of this story, of this big thing that God is doing, this final part of the story that started in creation. Because all that is left when Jesus is sat at his right hand is for his enemies to be put under his feet. And then every promise gets its perfection, gets its 100% fulfillment in the eternal kingdom. And if you read on in chapter 12, you see what that hope is in 12:28. It is a kingdom that cannot be shaken. That's the hope. That's the final act moving towards that hope. So God is doing one big thing. He's building a kingdom that cannot be shaken with Jesus at the centre, who sits at God's right hand. So the next question is, what do people do? So what do we do in response to that one big act, that one big thing that God is doing? Now let's look again at verse 1 of chapter 12. We've read it a couple of times now. Therefore, since we're surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. And it goes on, looking to Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith. There is a great cloud of witnesses, which in this context is probably not the angels, but it's probably the faithful ones who have gone before. So all those people that were mentioned in the previous chapter, it's most likely those are the faithful cloud of witnesses, because we're still within that same sort of context. And the witnesses are not against us. Sometimes you hear people mentioning a great cloud of witnesses as though they're against you, kind of calling you out and shouting you down. The witnesses are not against us. The witnesses are more like the ones that are saying, look how, they're not the ones that are saying, look how well we did, I can't believe how rubbish you are. They're the ones who are saying, look, we're all pushing in the same direction here. We want you to be pushing on and to be pushing on and growing in faith. And so the witnesses are here encouraging us to lay aside every weight. The witnesses here are encouraging us to run with endurance the race that is marked out for us. And so these are two things we do in response. One of them is general, and one of them is specific. The general one is there, lay aside every weight and the sin which clings so closely. And I'm sure we've all seen the London Marathon. Apparently the Edinburgh Marathon is on today. I didn't know that until I was driving over. But we've all seen at least the London Marathon. And I'm sure we've all seen that it is a very difficult race. I heard recently someone mention that one guy over 2,000 years ago ran 26 miles and died. And since then, people have been running 26 miles and not dying, just so we've got something to hold over them. But that's what we do. And I think looking at that race, looking at that marathon distance, that if you're running in your shorts and t-shirt and your fancy trainers, it's going to be difficult enough. So those people that do it dressed as dinosaurs and dressed as Big Ben, and even the guy who's been going about carrying a fridge as he does the marathon, is absolutely mental. But can you imagine them running as Big Ben or carrying the fridge if their life depended on it? Absolutely not. If you're running for your life, you don't pack the fridge on your back. You run, you throw the weight off and you run. And in the same way, this passage is saying, everybody cast that weight off. Cast off that weight of sin. To do what you can to resist sin, to avoid sin, to see sin as a problem that's going to be dragging you back in this race that you're running. Because it will get in the way, it will slow you down, it will pull you back from running after God in faith. So wherever we see it in our lives, the general command to us here is cast it off, get rid of it, do something to push it to the side. And that is any sin for any person. You know, there are particular things that the people who receive this letter are struggling with. But here he just seems to be saying any sin that's going to drag you back is going to stop you from running well and running the race. Now that's a pretty normal New Testament statement, isn't it? It's the sort of statement that we expect from a New Testament author. It's absolutely fine. You know, that God's got something to tell us, and he will tell us over and over and over again until we get it. But then we also move to the specific as well. So it's not only that general statement, cast off the weight of sin, but he says, and run with endurance the race that is set before us. Look to Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith. The race that we run is the race that is set before us. Now, at one level, we're all in the same race, aren't we? Our lives are all lived in reference to that one big thing that God is doing in history and in the future and in the world. We all trust in Jesus. We all have our hope in the promises of God. We're all focused on that unshakable kingdom. We're all running the same race. But you saw in the previous chapter, in chapter 11, that the specific ways that this is worked out in individuals' lives can look very different from one person to another. For Noah, faithful obedience, running his race, looked like building the ark, whereas for Abraham it was moving to the land that God had promised. For Sarah it was hoping in the child and moving towards that. And for Rahab it's that one day that the spies came to her house, she took them in and she hid them and she kept them safe. Now, notice that these people are mainly just living faithful lives and they're responding to the things that come up in their lives as God needs them to do something and wants them to do something at a point in their life. So it causes us to ask, what does it look like to run the race marked out for us? For each of us it looks a bit different, doesn't it? For many it's in how we raise our families and faithfully witnessing to God and caring for the people around about us. For many of us it's how we go about work on a day-to-day way. For many of us, it's how we build relationships with our neighbours and the people that we care about in our community. For many of us, it's how we speak to friends about Jesus, how we invite friends to come and hear in the gospel story for themselves. It's totally normal things. It's the things that exist in each of our lives, just doing them faithfully with that hope set in the future, and that, you know, that our eyes set on that big picture of what God is doing and taking some hope and inspiration about that. It's living faithfully, it's looking for opportunities to put faith into action. For some people, that's taking a year out to study the Bible. Those are the people that I get to hang out with and spend some time with. For some, and some of them will return to their jobs. Some of them will return to their churches and they'll be able to do things a bit better, or hopefully a bit better, or they'll be able to be useful in some way. Some will move on into full-time Christian work, and will take that on as their main source of employment and what they do. Because for some people, full-time Christian work is the race marked out for them. But the important thing is that individuals run the race marked out for them, whatever that looks like. Because at the end of the day, God is doing one big thing. He's building a kingdom that is centered on his Son. And we all get to be part of that, every one of us. And we know that God will build his kingdom. The thing that he started, he will finish. The thing that he wanted to do, he will achieve. The thing that we've already got Jesus sitting at the right hand of his Father. There's not much left for God to do. And our lives get to reflect that. We get to live in the reality of that big picture reality that's out there. So we're left with the call, by faith, grasp onto God's promises. Live life based on the reality of what he is doing. Lay aside sin, trust Jesus, and run the race that is set before you. I want to pray. Father, I thank you for where we are now. Lord, I thank you that us born in this generation are able to see so much of what you've done through your Son already. That we're able to have our faith and confidence set in that knowledge of what you've done through Jesus, and we're able to think on him and sat at your right hand. Lord, help us to grasp onto these big picture realities and help them to drive us forward, so that in our day-to-day, in our walk, in our individual conversations, we have confidence and we're able to go in faith, and we're able to be taken forward to do the things that you have marked out for us. Lord, help us to just act faithfully, to react, to look for opportunities to serve you. We ask you in Jesus' name. Amen.